All right, can everyone hear me? All right, I think my audio is good. Okay, everyone can hear me? Great. Yeah, if I seem a little low energy, it is because I am going to be losing this hat at the end of this this actual presentation, and the prospect of losing it is a little bit sad. But you know, like all things, you know, things must come to an end at some point. So I ordered a new hat this morning. It'll arrive at my house, so don't worry too much about that. All right, anyway, my presentation is titled How Bitcoin Changes Incentives. And I wanted to make this presentation because I wanted to think about you know, how things change. And I think in your bulletin it's something like how Bitcoin changes our mental model. And they're kind of similar things, but really, as I thought more about this topic, it occurred to me that, you know, a lot of the incentives that we have in the current system, they're kind of bad. They're very sinister. And in examining it, I came to the conclusion that there's a lot just to think about in terms of the current incentives and how Bitcoin fixes all of it. So anyway, I'm going to go through this in sort of 4 stages, starting sort of at the lowest level. We're going to start at the level of the individual. And from there, we're going to go to the level of companies. Like it or not, that happens to be what we're all organized into. You know, when you meet someone, you first ask them, you know, where do you work? And not necessarily, you know, what tribe they're from or something like that. Then we'll go on to the next level, which is nations, and then finally the world, like the global community, and how that's all affected. Anyway, let's get into the individual level and what the current system is like and what the incentives are. A lot of this is going to be kind of familiar to you, but in many ways it's a lot like fish and water, right? Like fish don't know that they're swimming in water. And it's only when, you know, they're lacking water that they kind of realize it. In the same way, a lot of this is sort of very familiar to us, but it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. So first thing I want to point out is that there is currently no real easy way to store value, right? In the current system, you know, it's based on Keynesian economics, and for Keynesian economics, it's required that money flow through the system. If there's any place that the money can get parked, it's not flowing through the system. So they've made it purposefully difficult to store value anywhere. In fact, about the only and the reason why you can't just like keep it in dollars is because of the inflation that's going on. And inflation is not CPI, right? The classical definition of inflation is the amount of the supply of something that increases every year. And if you look at the M2 money supply for the US dollar, from 1959, this is taken straight from the St. Louis Fed, to now it's increased by a multiple of 51, which is an insane number, right? Multiple of 51 over the last 60 years. And if you annualize that, that's something around 6.7%. Now, the other 2 stores of value, the 2 stores of value that are kind of available are real estate and stocks. Right? Real estate and stocks. Now, I mean, never mind like the insane transaction costs and the friction that comes along with those 2. The fact of the matter is that if you invested in either of those things and you're getting 6.7%, that's considered pretty good, right? That tells you that we are all really just kind of running to stay in the same place. That's essentially what this whole system is made to do. You have to work hard in order to keep the value that you have. And that's a big insight about the individual level. There's no real good place to store value because of the overlords, the economists, the people that are in power. They want you to keep running to stay in the same place. And how a lot of other people react is that, you know, if it's that hard to store value, this is what they're going to do, right? You don't need to store value if there is no value, right? If you don't have anything of value, well, then you don't need to store it. So they end up spending, they end up consuming, they end up doing whatever you know, floats their boat for the moment, and they have very high time preference behavior as a result of the fact that there is no good place to store value. And how does Bitcoin fix this? Well, Bitcoin fixes it because there is now a good store of value. And when you have that, your behavior starts to change, especially at the individual level. All right, so another consequence is that because there's a very, storing value is very hard, the people that actually have money, well, they spend a ton of time trying to store their value instead of creating value. And this is a major detriment to society and civilization in general. Because, if you know any rich people, you know that they spend a lot of time in due diligence, right? They're trying to look for the right property to invest in. They're trying to look for the right stock to invest in. Which mutual fund should I buy? Which bond should I buy? Which thing should I get? This is all time that is spent not creating. And it's not anything productive, because the same research that you end up doing, somebody else is going to do again, because they don't trust, right? Like, you can have like bond rating agencies or whatever, but we know how corrupt those things can get. So essentially, what ends up happening is that all of these people that have all this productive capacity, that have all this wealth, instead of creating value, they're striving and running to stay in the same place that they are. That's what ends up happening. And as a result of all this, we get all kinds of insanity, right? Like, we get insane asset inflation, right? The first three are like a New York taxi cab medallion, a Michael Jordan rookie card, and a Rothko painting. Those things are, have some utility, but they have a value far beyond the utility that that should be there. In part because people want to store value somewhere, and you get some insane asset inflation. You have modern art, right? There's a book like the $12 million shark. Some guy stuffed a shark and sold it for $12 million. And it's insane that sort of thing is happening. It's because there's no good place to store value. So fine art becomes this thing where, okay, maybe this will happen. And the thing about stores of value is that it gives a perception that you are just lucky, right? Because if you store, most stores of value are not fungible at all. If you're looking at like real estate or different stocks or something like that, because of their lack of fungibility, somebody that gets lucky with a particular part of real estate, right? You happen to have owned something in San Francisco like 20 years ago versus somebody in Iowa. I mean, you're going to have made a lot more money as somebody that owned property in San Francisco. That just happens to be luck. It's not distributed in any sort of fair way, or it's more cynically done because of the powers that be. Other stuff that happens is that materialism, grows because, well, I don't have a way to store value. Might as well, do something flashy with it. That is a Chanel handbag where the chain is made out of diamonds. I still remember, like 20 years ago, the most expensive handbag you could get was like $1,000 bucks. Now it's like $100,000, right? Something has happened. Similar thing with cars, right? That's a Bugatti. And it used to be like the most expensive car you could get was like $300,000. Now it's like well over $1 million. It's crazy, and that's kind of what happens. And finally, that last picture is of a rapper eating a $1,500 donut, right? That's a $1,500 gold leaf covered donut. This is what people do when there's no store of value. They need some flashy way to show off, right? This is what having no good store of value does to people, is that it makes them like essentially very shallow, like consuming and showing off and doing things like that. Ultimately, the big problem here is that instead of reaching for the stars, right, like trying to create something new, everyone is absolutely more concerned with protecting their downside because there is no good store of value. And this is not just true in the United States, but all over the world. This is a much bigger deal because things can go south so quickly and things can get so bad so quickly that you have to find places to put money. And you see this all the time. You see this with people in China, right? They're buying up property in Vancouver and Toronto and wherever they can find it, because that's a hard asset. That's not going to lose value. And we saw with the Chinese yuan, right? Like that's degrading in value. So that was actually a very good move to go buy real estate. And this is what happens when you don't have a good store of value, is that really the rich people get richer. That's essentially what's been happening. So that's at the individual level. So let's take a look at the level above that. And that's, like I said, that's at the level of companies. And that's sort of how we're organized right now. It's not really by tribe anymore, or even ethnic group or anything like that. It's by whatever company you happen to be working for. The big thing about companies is that there's a Cantillon effect. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically that the first users of the newly printed money get all of the benefits. And that means that companies that have access to cheap loans get to benefit a lot more instead of the smaller companies. And that's had some tremendous consequences for civilization. So among other things, it means some serious debt-fueled growth. And if you're a large company, you have access to loans that are very, very cheap. If you think about it, the central bank makes a lot more loans available to their member banks. Most of their member banks that do loans are actually commercial banks. And if you're a commercial bank, you can lend, say you have $200 million to lend. You can either lend $200 million to one company, or you can make $102 million loans to 100 small companies. Which are you going to do? It's a no-brainer, right? You're going to do the 200 million. In fact, you take a discount, right, and make less money, just so you don't have all that paperwork and due diligence that you'd have to do. So all of that debt gets pushed to these large companies. And what do they do with that money? Well, if you're smart and you're a pretty decent company, what are you going to do? Well, you could undercut your competition. All those small companies, you're just going to undercut them until they go out of business and then raise prices. Or you can lobby for government regulation so that it's difficult for them. Or, barring all of that, you can just go use that money to do a buyout of the companies that are the most innovative. This means that the big companies get even bigger, and the small companies have to basically fight uphill, right? They have to run to stay in the same place, whereas the large companies, they get to, get access to all this debt-fueled growth. In fact, that sort of mentality has trickled down even to, like college students, right? They're doing debt-fueled growth in a way, and this is what ends up happening, is that they have a lifetime of debt thinking that they can do that same thing. Anyway, all of this results in a winner-take-all company, winner-take-all economy, where and like the people that know this the most are venture capitalists. They know what the deal is. They know that if you get past a certain level of size, that you're going to have a massive advantage over everyone else. So it is growth at all costs. This is where the whole unicorn meme comes from with respect to venture capital, is that they want billion-dollar companies. Why? Because you have an advantage at $1 billion that you do not have in this economy at any smaller level. And it is an almost like unbelievably large advantage that if you can get to that level, you are going to stay there for a very long time, because there are all sorts of ways in which the state supports you, and all sorts of interdependency and fragility that we'll talk about. But this is very obvious to anyone that's a VC, right? Like they don't fund small companies. Why? Well, because they're searching for unicorns. They know that this is where the sweet spot in the economy is. And really, the big thing to note is that there's an emphasis on size and not on innovation, right? It's not about creating new things anymore. This economy, the way this whole system is set up, is to encourage bigger and bigger things. And I love this cartoon because here's a guy like that's trying to innovate something, and he's like, oh well, I could just whip them harder. That's essentially what the innovation in companies ends up being, is getting more out of their workers instead of actually innovating new products. The coordination problem in large companies tends to do that. So that's companies. We've covered the individual level, the company level. Now let's get to the nation level. And this is where a lot of the problems that if you're a libertarian you know about already. But first of all, there's a pretty major moral hazard, right? Like if you are the entity that's in charge and could create a budget, and you can also print money, and you have a giant moral hazard. You might print money for yourself. You might print money for your cronies. You might print money for stuff that you want and not necessarily what the population wants. And it is a giant moral hazard. And that leads to everything in government being completely disconnected from price, right? Like they don't care how much things cost. So I talked recently with a few people that work with the healthcare website. Do you guys remember this? How much of a disaster that was? So apparently the government, in all its wisdom, decided to spend $700 million to pay a contractor to make the website. And they had all these requirements. It took them 18 months to do it. And at the end of the 18 months, everyone found out very spectacularly that the website did not work. It couldn't scale past 50 users, which is horrible, right? And so what happened was Todd Park, CTO of the United States, he flew out to Silicon Valley and talked to a couple of Google engineers and said, you know what, your country needs you. Can you come help us out? They came in. They fixed a few of the problems, and they said, you know what, we're going to have to rebuild this thing. And so they hired some of their friends and rebuilt the whole thing. It took them 9 weeks and $10 million. 9 weeks and $10 million. Why did it take 70 times less money, right, and 8 times less time with much, much fewer people to get that done, right? The government does not care about price at all because, and to some degree this is true of any government, but because they have the ability to print money, they'll do whatever they want, essentially. And all these bureaucrats don't care about price. They care more about climbing up the ladder of bureaucracy or something like that. The crazy thing is, though they only spent $10 million on it, what I found out was that Congress at that time was so embarrassed that they were willing to put in another $200 million if necessary to get that thing done. Doesn't that tell you something about how broken everything is? Anyway, some of the other things that happen as a result is that the government ends up with a larger purview. And you probably know this quote from Spider-Man: with great power comes great responsibility. Yeah, and certainly money, the ability to print money is great responsibility. Great power. So that comes with it a great responsibility. And the typical thing is, well, the government needs to do something about this. And there's no real good answer to it when you have fiat money. Because, well, the government needs to pay for my lung cancer. And it's, if you have if you have the ability to fix that, why wouldn't you? Never mind that you've been smoking for 30 years and that a lot of that is your fault, right? There's no real limit to the government anymore. And that gives them a moral imperative to do something. And of course, because of the bureaucracy, this is what ends up happening. Yes, we can fix that, except we probably won't because we're pretty incompetent. Anyway, the whole system, because of the giant companies that exist and because of the inefficiencies of government, it's currently set up to support a lot of these large companies. If you think about it, a large portion of the banking system pumps money into the big companies so that they can grow larger, that they can eliminate competition and so on. Even the education system, right? It's churning out cogs for big companies instead of you get a degree as an accountant or something, right? And it's a cog that can fit in, many different company machines. That's how the whole system is currently designed. And of course, government regulation, they're designed to protect these things. And it's not because they're being evil per se. It's because the entire economy is dependent on these large companies. So if you let any of them fall, then dominoes start falling, and you might have great suffering and depression. It's a very fragile system. Anyway, we've looked at things at the individual level. We looked at the things from the company level. We looked at things from the nation level. Now let's go to sort of the more broad scope global level. And the first thing to recognize in the global level is right now we're under a dollar hegemony. And this is something that not a lot of people know. I'm sure a lot of you guys in this room know. But we've been under a dollar hegemony since about 1944 with Bretton Woods. And this is, I like to tell people that there were two superpowers after World War II. One decided to control their sphere of influence through violence, the other through markets, kind of. So Soviet Union obviously, like invaded rebelling countries and put in puppet dictators and so on. I mean, not that the US didn't do some of that either. But mainly it was through the dollar hegemony. And it was through forcing other central banks to keep dollars in reserve and making the dollar the standard, the unit of settlement in international trade. So essentially, the unit of account for the entire world became the US dollar. And most central banks to this day try to keep their currency within a certain range of the US dollar for trade purposes. And of course, after 1971, when Nixon broke the tie with gold and changed to the petrodollar, this has meant a lot of endless war in the Middle East that's sort of still persisting. We're still in Iraq, still in Afghanistan. That combined with being completely disconnected from price due to being able to print whatever money they want has meant a lot of devastation in that region. But more than that, there's a global Cantillon effect. And we talked about this earlier. The first printers of that money get most of its benefits. And we have to be honest here, right? Even though we're in the US, a lot of the prosperity that we have is on the backs of people all over the world. Right? A lot of the inflation that we have goes to those countries via the treasuries that they buy. And then those countries inflate, and those poor suckers at the end, in the poor countries, they suffer the most. And this is why the poor countries, they hyperinflate much faster. And it's a sad situation. Because it's not a level playing field. Like where you were born matters a significant amount to what you're able to achieve. And that's the whole system, right? It's completely interdependent. It's completely fragile, and there's a lot of ways in which a small thing happening could cause a domino effect that crushes the whole thing. But here's the good news. Bitcoin fixes this. Bitcoin fixes it all, right? See, Bitcoin changes the incentives for every level. At the individual level, now you have a good store of value. That means that you don't have to run to stand still. You can think about new ways to make money, new innovations that you can make that better civilization. And companies won't be, just taking advantage of the cheap loans that they get and doing debt-fueled growth. Instead, they have to actually save up to grow, right? And nations, they're not going to cater their entire system to these large companies. It's going to be much more limited and budget conscious. And at the global level, you're not going to have this global Cantillon effect. You're not going to have the dollar hegemony. You're going to instead have a much more level playing field. And that means that people living everywhere can do something that they can add value to civilization. And this is how Bitcoin changes incentives. Bitcoin fixes all of this stuff. Bitcoin makes it so that we don't have to run to stay in the same place. We're not on a treadmill. See, all of that running is keeping the current system alive. We have to do that in order to circulate money, in order to keep the people in power that are in power and so on. Like that cartoon I showed you earlier, we're essentially moving those large stones and like benefiting the people that are in power that get to print the money, that get to do all of these things. The Nouriel Rabinis of the world, they get to benefit off of our backs, and that's what Bitcoin Fix is. Thank you. How are we doing on time, Gary?
Lots of time. Lots.
Okay.
You got about 20.
Okay. Well, when I practiced it in my hotel room, it was 35 minutes, but I guess it was less. Huh? Okay, all right, so let's do some Q&A. All right. Yeah.
So we see where we are and we see where we'd like to go.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you think we need to go? What's going to be the path? How is that going to be accelerated?
Yeah, as people adopt Bitcoin, I think all of this sort of naturally happens. Exactly what the steps to get there is really hard to tell. That said, I do think that once it becomes more of a store of value, it naturally then starts inflating all the other stuff, because and it'll be very clear that Bitcoin's the more superior store of value, and then merchants will be just like, hey, I don't want this shitcoin called USD. I want Bitcoin instead, and that's when it transitions into method of payment, and then after method of payment, then it becomes more unit of account. But I mean, that's roughly the path. Is that going to cause geopolitical turmoil? Is that going to cause like large companies to go bankrupt in the middle of it? Is that going to, cause certain nations to just, adopt the Bitcoin standard early? I don't know. This is the interesting thing, is that we know where all the incentives and motivators are. But how people react and how they try to counter or suppress or whatever, that's incredibly difficult to predict, and I hesitate to put out any of those. Yeah?
So at the beginning, you said there was no place to go,
Mm-hmm.
and I would argue that there was a place to go. It was gold,
Mm-hmm.
and the Bretton Woods was actually based on the fact that the dollar was based on gold,
Mm-hmm.
not the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not trying to argue gold versus Bitcoin, but
Yeah.
if Bitcoin becomes a place to go,
Mm-hmm.
why will people go there if they didn't go to gold?
Right, so the big thing about gold is that it became really centralized. So most of the gold today is in like giant vaults, right? Like very few people have gold coins at their house, although I suspect that in this crowd there's probably a good number of those. And this is the thing, when you centralize it, is that you can fractionally reserve lend it. And this is something that gold vaults have done for ages. And that means that there's inflation. You can't really trust that you actually have the gold that the bank says you have, and so on. Centralization was a natural part of the fact that it's a physical commodity. With Bitcoin, it's a digital commodity, and that means that you don't need to centralize it. Although certainly a lot of people do, like, for example, keep it on Coinbase or whatever. The fact that you can much more easily secure it at home than Bitcoin. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still a very hard problem to secure it at home. But it's a lot easier than something like a $1 million gold bar or something. That means that it really is much more decentralized. And that decentralization is the motive for making it more of a store of value than something that could collapse, or I mean, like if you invested all your stock in Enron, like that would be horrible. In some ways, like if you have your gold in like the wrong vault that's fractionally reserved lending or something like that, then that may be similar to how it would happen to you. So I would say that as Bitcoin continues to prove itself over time, more people will be adopting it, simply just due to the supply-demand. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, you want to talk about like your thoughts on how much of a beneficiary the stock market is at large to the current fiat money inflationary policy?
Yeah, I would say a lot of it, right? And this has been the case since fiat money arrived. I think the PE ratios used to be like a PE ratio of like 6 to 10 was considered insane. Now it's like, you know, that's like on the low range. And that's because it's not about the utility of stock anymore. It's more about there's a much bigger premium because people want to store it there. And that's kind of a sad situation. And you know, one of the things that I think will happen as more people move to Bitcoin is that a lot of these things go closer to their utility value and less towards you know, this inflated value like real estate, like art, or you know, stocks or whatever. You know, it'll be more based on like how much income you can get from rent, or you know, what the price to earnings and dividends that you might be able to get and things like that. More fundamental drivers rather than you know, drivers based on people piling in. So yeah, that's what I suspect will happen.
Isn't that what we have right now? I mean, obviously a PE ratio of 24 based on a speculative interest. Obviously, I mean, a value of 11,000 on Bitcoin. I mean, it could be argued that's speculative as well.
Well, I mean, it's because Bitcoin is being used as a store of value. Bitcoin's a better store of value than all of these other things because it's more liquid, it's more fungible, and it's essentially kind of fair and takes luck out of the system. If you stored value in real estate and you had one like maybe even a block away, one might be worth a lot more than the other later just because it's kind of, you know, it's like half block closer to the subway station that gets built, right? Like it's so not store of value that's not fungible has a lot of problems, and it's not very fair, and it makes you have to spend way more time on the investment itself, like I said, and that's a lot of energy that's being taken away from creating value instead, you know, running to stay in the same place. Yeah.
And you see very few companies or Bitcoin companies that have become a big success from a sort of company perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Not multi-billion euro. But you see a lot of individual people that have become very, essentially, very humane, very great people thanks to the empowerment of Bitcoin.
Mm.
I see a lot more successful Bitcoiners as humans than a lot of successful Bitcoin companies.
Mm.
And do you think that's something that we're going to keep going, or might we get to a stage whereby, for example, the US government says, well, we can have Bitcoin, but only with banks or custodians and whatnot, and not with individuals? How do you see that happening?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, people are going to have to learn personal responsibility, right? Holding a lot of Bitcoin yourself is like really scary, and you know, screwing up or something, and the prospect of losing a significant part of your wealth is not easy to handle, and we're used to outsourcing that sort of thing. But the great thing is, once you learn some personal responsibility, it turns out it carries over to lots of other parts of your life, which means that you're going to be more responsible in, you know, how you spend your time, how you you know, relate to others, and so on. Which I think you know, I can say pretty fairly that I've seen a lot of in the Bitcoin community, is that, you know, you come in and, you know, you come in for the gains, and then you stay for sort of the personal growth that you experience. You know, when you start questioning everything, that's kind of how it is. Yeah, over there.
What is something Bitcoin won't fix?
Possible supernovas that might happen, I guess. Yeah, I mean, maybe earthquakes. Yeah, natural disasters. Yeah, possibly. I leave open the possibility that Bitcoin might fix those too, but those are the ones I have doubts about. Yeah. Yeah.
One added thing that I've noticed myself that has mixed factors, and that's social pressure.
Mm.
So having a store of value, particularly of stock. So you have examples like FANG stocks
Mm-hmm.
that receive, in my opinion, more value than they might
Yeah, yeah, I see a lot of what you're saying is that like large companies are just kind of unnatural in the first place. If you think about it, small companies have a lot of advantages that large companies don't. Like it's usually under Dunbar's number, which means that you can know everybody. And for somebody that's running a smaller company like that, you tend to be more humane when you know everybody. And you tend to be a lot more cognizant of who's not performing and so on. Whereas with a big company, that's not the case at all. It's very much a bureaucracy. You have no idea who's doing a good job, who's not doing a good job. So the structurally, I think you go towards more small companies and, instead of these large companies that have maybe some of these technologies that might not be beneficial to everyone. And instead of like these massive black swan events that like sort of displace a lot of people, you have much smaller, you have more local volatility, but not these giant waves of, cascading, vulnerabilities that happen all over the economy like we did in 2008. And that's a good thing. We want to be more anti-fragile as a society, and Bitcoin's the first step. Yeah.
What's your opinion on the prospects for a smooth-ish transition versus a rough transition?
Well, so a smooth transition would look like central banks starting to use it or to buy it as like a reserve currency. The central banks that do, their currencies start rising against other currencies, and then like sort of becoming a safe haven for sound money or something like that. And then more countries adopting that and getting off the gold standard and starting to sort of settle with each other using Bitcoin instead of US dollar or something like that. I mean, that's a relatively safe and peaceful way. It's also possible that you have, a government just straight up ban Bitcoin, and then all the Bitcoiners go somewhere else, and you have to kind of play whack-a-mole as these other governments maybe get pressured or something like that. It's hard to tell, but yeah, there are bad scenarios. So I mean, this is why you should be really good with your OPSEC. More reason to secure your Bitcoins well. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking about corporations and central banks, where do you see Bitcoin's future in the short term and the long term if these certain corporations start rolling out their own digital currencies and central banks, such as like the Libra project and the Public Bank of China releasing their own digital currency?
Yeah, I'm not worried about any of those, to be honest. So their main concern is allowing it's again the Keynesian philosophy. It's about velocity of money, making sure that there's no friction when people want to spend, and it's all spend. And that's fine, but the harder money is going to win. That's Gresham's law, and Bitcoin is the harder money. No matter what the central bank tells you, they always have the option of printing more money. And that means that people are going to go towards Bitcoin in the long run. Short run, maybe it disrupts things, but long term, I don't think it affects anything. All right, Gary, you want to come up?